The new culvert went in on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the Cypress Hollow Homeowners Association had posted a photo of it on their community board with the caption, "Drainage improvements, your dues at work." It was a handsome piece of concrete, I'll give them that. 36 inches of freshly poured pipe running along the upper edge of their subdivision, with a tidy rip-rap outlet aimed politely downhill toward the low back corner of my land. Everyone in Cypress Hollow apparently looked at it and saw civic pride. I looked at it and saw a loaded gun, though it took one good rain to prove it, and at that point I still gave them the benefit of the doubt, which in hindsight was the most naive I've been in about a decade. My name is Wes Okafor.
I'm 46 years old, a licensed professional engineer, and I have spent 30 years designing stormwater systems and testifying as an expert witness in flooding cases, which is to say, I have stood on the other side of exactly this kind of dispute more times than I can count, watching some homeowner's lawyer try and fail to explain hydrology to a jury. I bought my 3 acres in unincorporated North Carolina precisely because I understood the land. A low, creek-fed parcel that a lesser buyer would have called a swamp risk and that I called a solved problem, because water is only a threat when you don't respect where it wants to go. My property isn't in the HOA, never has been. It just sits downhill from it, and downhill, I would soon be reminded, is the oldest disadvantage in the world. The first real storm came 10 days later.
2¼ inches over 4 hours. I know the number exactly, because I keep an amateur weather station on a post at the field's edge, next to a trail camera I'd put up years ago for the deer and the herons. By morning, the lower half-acre of my land, which had never once flooded in the 6 years I'd owned it, was a brown sheet of standing water lapping at the base of my equipment shed. I stood there in my boots doing the math in my head, and the math was ugly, because 2¼ inches doesn't do that. Something had changed the size of the water's front door. I went straight to the HOA president. Diane Fairbanks, 55, the kind of woman who is on a first-name basis with every county commissioner and mentions it inside 90 seconds of meeting you. She met me on her porch with a face prearranged into sympathy. "Oh, Wes, it's just been a terrible season for weather," she said, before I'd finished my sentence.
And then, gently, like she was doing me a kindness, "You know, that back parcel of yours has always been so wet. Have you ever thought about just selling it? Life's too short to fight the rain." I hadn't mentioned selling. I hadn't mentioned anything except water. I thanked her, drove home, and started driving stakes into the mud, because a woman who offers you an exit before you've described the problem already knows the problem. I pulled the county's LIDAR elevation data that night, laser-scanned ground contours, accurate to inches, and layered it over the GIS parcel maps, and I built a quick hydraulic model of the whole watershed the way I've built 100 of them for people who paid me a great deal of money to do it. The result wasn't ambiguous. That 36-inch culvert didn't relieve the subdivision's drainage. It collected it, rerouted the runoff from something like 19 acres of roofs, driveways, and streets that used to disperse in 4 directions, and aimed the entire concentrated slug of it at the exact lowest point of my land. The diameter was right, the slope was right, the outlet was right. It was, from an engineering standpoint, beautiful work. You do not aim water that precisely by accident. Someone had designed my flood. So I brought my folder to the next open HOA meeting, and that was my first real taste of what fighting this board was going to feel like. I laid out the LIDAR, the model, the before and after, speaking the plainest English I own, and Diane let me get about 90 seconds in before she rapped her little gavel and informed me that my time as a guest was expiring. When I kept talking, a board member cut my microphone. When I raised my voice to be heard over the murmur, 2 of them started talking loudly about the next agenda item, the community's landscaping budget, as though I had already left the room. "Everything about that culvert is fully permitted and approved, Mr. Okafor," Diane said over me, smiling for the crowd. "We won't have baseless accusations at a community meeting." I walked out to polite, relieved applause. I have been thrown out of nicer rooms, but rarely more efficiently.
Then came the part that turned a flooding problem into a conspiracy, and it arrived, as these things do, with a firm handshake. 4 days after I embarrassed myself at that meeting, a man in a good shirt showed up in my driveway representing a development company I'd never heard of, with an offer already printed. He wanted to buy my 3 acres. The number he named was roughly a third of what the land had been worth the previous spring. A fair price, he said, given the obvious flooding issues and the low market value of wetland. He said the word wetland like a diagnosis. And that was the moment the whole thing snapped into focus for me, cold and clean. The flood wasn't the disaster. The flood was the tool. Drown the land, crater the value, buy it cheap. I told him no, thanked him for the drive, and watched his taillights. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was the specific clarity of knowing exactly who is trying to do what to you. The HOA's response to my refusal was to escalate, and I have to admit they were creative about it. Within a week, I received a notice from an association I'm not even a member of, declaring that the sandbag berm and earthen ridge I'd built to protect my shed constituted an unpermitted structure impacting community drainage, and demanding I remove it. They followed that with a letter asserting that the HOA held a drainage easement across my back acre, a right they had apparently invented over the weekend, and that my berm was obstructing it. So let me make sure I understood their position, I wrote back. The water they engineered onto my land had now given them the right to my land. It was almost impressive. It was the logic of a man who breaks your window and then bills you for the draft. But now they'd made it a paper fight, and paper is my native country. I filed public records requests under North Carolina's open records law, and the county, unlike the HOA, is legally required to answer. Back came the construction contract for the drainage improvement, and there in the billing was a name I filed away without fanfare at the time, but now read very carefully. The work had been coordinated through an entity called Cypress Hollow Holdings, LLC. Not the HOA, a limited liability company. I pulled the state stormwater permit next, filed with the Environmental Quality Department, and found the thing that made my hands go still. The culvert as built did not match the culvert as permitted. The approved plan called for a smaller pipe with a dispersed outlet. Someone had quietly upsized it and pointed it at me in direct violation of a state permit. That wasn't a gray area. That was a documented, signable violation, and it had a name attached. They hit back harder, because cornered boards always do. A cease-and-desist arrived accusing me of defamation for spreading false claims about the association. Diane worked the neighbors, and a couple of them stopped waving at me on the road. Someone floated the idea of blocking my driveway, which crossed a shared easement, until a lawyer presumably told them that was a felony's worth of stupid. And in the middle of all of it, the sky opened up, 4.5 inches in one night, a genuine gully washer. And this time the water didn't stop at the shed. It came for the house and the well. I spent that entire night alone in headlamp light, hauling and stacking sandbags until my back gave out, holding a line against 19 acres of other people's rain. But I am not a man who suffers in the dark for nothing, so between loads I kept walking to the field edge to check the trail camera and the weather station, because that machine was quietly logging every 100th of an inch and time-stamping every frame of the flood at its worst. I was drowning and building my evidence at the same time, which is either good discipline or a personality disorder, and I've stopped trying to tell the difference. Morning brought 2 gifts. The first was a neighbor named Hollis from the far edge of the subdivision, whose own yard had started flooding once the culvert redirected the flow, and who arrived at my fence genuinely furious and ready to talk. The second was a reporter from the County Weekly who had smelled something in the public records office and wanted to know why a hydrologist was requesting stormwater permits at 7 in the morning. I made them both coffee. An enemy who monologues at meetings is a nuisance. A well-organized citizen with a reporter and a spreadsheet is a different animal, and Diane had spent months teaching me exactly which one to become. Because the real opportunity was already on the calendar. The developer had a rezoning application. The whole point of the exercise, the reason my cheap wetland mattered, coming up for a public hearing before the County Board of Commissioners. An open meeting. Cameras, minutes, public comment, and a panel that answered to voters rather than to Diane's gavel. It was the one arena in this entire war where her monolithic little board had no gavel to bang and no microphone to cut, and I intended to hold my whole case until I was standing in it. I spent 2 weeks building exhibits the way I'd build them for a federal courtroom, walked Hollis and a dozen soaked neighbors through what to say, and made sure that reporter knew exactly which night to show up. The hearing room was full. Diane spoke first, and she was good, warm, civic, talking about responsible growth and protecting property values, which I would later appreciate as the single most ironic phrase uttered in that county all year, given that her entire scheme depended on destroying one specific person's property value on purpose. Then I got my 3 minutes, and I did not waste them. I put the culvert on the screen and showed the commissioners the hydraulic model, that this pipe was engineered deliberately to concentrate 19 acres of runoff onto my land, its diameter and slope and aim all calculated. I put up the time-stamped flood footage and the rainfall logs beside it, the machine's own testimony that the drowning of my land tracked exactly to the day that culvert went live, killing the "it's just the weather" defense on the spot. I showed them the state permit and the as-built pipe side by side, the violation plain enough for anyone. And then I put up the last slide, the one I'd been holding all night, and connected the culvert's contractor, Cypress Hollow Holdings, LLC, to the entity behind the lowball offer on my land, and to the president of the Homeowners Association, Diane Fairbanks, who held an undisclosed ownership stake in the very deal she'd just stood up and championed as a disinterested public servant. The room made a sound I can only describe as an inhale that forgot to come back out. It fell apart for them fast after that, the way engineered things fail all at once when you pull the one member holding the load. The commissioners tabled and then buried the rezoning. You cannot vote yes on a project after watching its chief booster get exposed as a secret owner on live camera. The conflict of interest disclosure got referred to the County Ethics Board and, from there, toward a corruption inquiry that is, last I heard, still very much ongoing. The Environmental Department opened a formal violation case on the permit. Diane resigned from the association within the week to focus on personal matters, and the developer's option on the neighboring land evaporated once the water problem became a criminal referral problem. I was awarded restoration of the drainage and damages for the flooding, though honestly the money was the least satisfying part. The most satisfying part came a month later, on a clear afternoon, when the county work crew finally cut that beautiful concrete culvert loose and turned the water back the way gravity had always intended. I walked down to the field edge, checked that the weather station was still logging, and reset it for the coming season. Channel author here, stepping out of Wes's boots, because this one is a masterclass in how greed disguises itself as landscaping. Where did Diane go wrong? Start with the culvert. She treated a piece of infrastructure as invisible, assumed nobody would ever measure a drainage improvement, and she aimed it at the one downhill neighbor on Earth who designs these systems for a living. Then she let the developer's lowball offer arrive right on the heels of the flood, welding motive to method for anyone paying attention. And fatally, she ran the whole thing through an LLC whose name sat in a public contract, then stood up in a public meeting to champion her own hidden deal. The pipe proved intent, the weather logs proved timing, and the LLC proved the conflict. 3 quiet details, 3 loaded guns, all of them hers. Practical takeaways. Concentrated stormwater deliberately dumped onto a downhill neighbor is a real tort in most states, not just bad luck. Public records laws are a weapon ordinary people forget they own. That contract was one request away the whole time. And when a board owns the gavel, change the room. Take the fight to the public body they can't control. Question for you. If your neighbor's HOA engineered a flood to steal your land cheap, Would you have outlawyered them on paper like Wes, or grabbed a shovel and settled it the old-fashioned way? Tell me below.